This is the second video on gathering data. The first video was on the different types of sampling methods and their advantages and disadvantages. This second video I will be talking about surveys and bias. Bias in surveys is undesirable but often unavoidable. In this video I will discuss some major types of bias that may occur in the sampling process. A good sample must be representative of the population. This means that each sample point or member should represent the attributes or the characteristics of the entire population. Bias often occurs when the survey sample does not accurately represent the population. The bias that results from this sample that is not representative is called selection bias. A major type of selection bias is undercoverage. Undercoverage occurs when some members of the population are inadequately represented in the sample. Telephone surveys suffer from a well-known source of coverage bias because they cannot include households without telephones. Another type of survey that includes this undercoverage is internet surveys because they cannot include those people who do not have internet. A classic example of undercoverage is the Literary Digest voter survey, which predicted that Alfred Landon would beat Franklin Roosevelt in the 1936 presidential election. The survey sample suffered from undercoverage of low-income voters, however, who tended to be Democrats. Now you wonder, how did this happen? Well, the survey relied on a convenience sample. They drew people for the survey from telephone directories and car registration lists. Well, in 1936, people who owned cars and telephones tended to be more affluent or well-off than those who didn't. Undercoverage is often a problem with convenience samples. Another type of bias that often occurs in surveys is non-response bias. Sometimes individuals chosen for the sample are unwilling or they're unable to participate in the survey. Non-response bias is the bias that results when those who respond differ in very meaningful ways from those who decide not to respond for different reasons. Another major type of bias is voluntary response bias. Voluntary response bias occurs when sample members are self-selected volunteers, as in voluntary samples. If the researcher appeals to people to voluntarily participate in a survey, this resulting sample are always biased. They only include people who choose to volunteer, whereas a random sample would need to include people whether or not they choose to volunteer. Often voluntary response samples oversample people who have very strong opinions and undersample people who don't care much about the topic of the survey. Thus, inferences from a voluntary response sample are not as trustworthy as conclusions based on a random sample of the entire population under consideration. An example of voluntary response bias would be call-in radio shows that solicit audience participation in surveys on very controversial topics, such as abortion, affirmative action, gun control, etc. The resulting sample tends to overrepresent those individuals who have very strong opinions about the topic. So, as we said earlier in a previous video, random sampling helps produce samples that are more representative of the entire population by eliminating this voluntary response bias and guarding against undercoverage bias. So all probability sampling methods rely on random sampling. Sometimes bias occurs due to measurement error and not all due to selection error. A poor measurement process can also lead to bias. In survey research, The measurement process includes the environment in which the survey is conducted, the way that the questions are asked, and the state of the people that are responding to the survey. Sometimes the survey questions themselves can demonstrate bias. I listed here a few examples of some ways that questions could demonstrate bias. There is deliberate bias, in which the researcher actually deliberately puts bias into the questions so that they get the response that they want. Here is a question asked in two ways. One to try to remain unbiased, and one to be deliberately biased. All right, the first one, if you found a wallet with $100 in it on the street, would you keep it? The second, with deliberate bias. If you found a wallet with $100 in it on the street, would you do the honest thing and return it to the person, or would you keep it? Second type I wanted to discuss was unintentional bias. Words sometimes mean different things when they're put in different contexts and to different types of people. For example, number 1, over the last few years, have you watched a lot of television? All right, number 2, the question asked a different way. In the last 2 years, have you watched more than 4 hours of television daily on average? Now, question 2 avoids the terms few and a lot, which may have different meanings to different people. All right, the third type, unnecessary complexity. Sometimes questions ask more than one question or are worded in a very confusing way. For example, you could ask, how do you feel about the ticket price and the stadium condition for varsity football? What if they feel the ticket price is too much but think the stadium is fine? Now, this needs to be two distinct questions instead of putting two different topics in the same question. All right, and the last one I want to discuss is the ordering of questions. The manner in which questions are ordered can create problems for two reasons. First, the earlier questions can bring to mind issues that might not otherwise be on the mind of the ones who are responding. Second, sometimes respondents think one question is supposed to apply to the previous one. Social desirability bias is the tendency of respondents to answer questions in a manner that will be viewed favorably by others. It can take the form of over-reporting good behavior or under-reporting bad or undesirable behavior. This tendency poses a serious problem with conducting research with self-reports, especially questionnaires. This bias interferes with the interpretation of average tendencies as well as individual differences. Most people like to present themselves in a favorable light, so they will be reluctant to admit to unsavory attitudes or illegal activities in a survey, particularly if the survey results are not confidential. Instead, their responses may be biased toward what they believe is socially desirable. A survey produces a sample statistic which is used to estimate a population parameter or a population statistic. If you repeated a survey many times using different samples each time, you would get a different sample statistic with each sample. And each of the different sample statistics would be an estimate for the same population parameter or statistics, even though you got a different one for each sample. Now, if the statistic is unbiased, the average of all the statistics from all possible samples will equal the true population parameter, even though any individual statistic may differ from the population parameter. So the variability, this difference among the statistics from different samples, is called the sampling error. Later on, I will show you how we find this sampling error, but that will be in a later video. Increasing the sample size tends to reduce the sampling error. That is, it makes the sample statistic less variable. However, increasing sample size does not affect survey bias. A large sample size cannot correct for the problems that result in the methods used in sampling that produce survey bias. For example, undercoverage, non-response bias, voluntary response bias, the questioning bias that happens, as well as social desirability bias, just for example. I would like to now just test your understanding of what I was talking about earlier with bias. Now, you do not have to copy down notes, just listen. Which of the following statements are true? 1. Random sampling is a good way to reduce response bias. 2. To guard against bias from undercoverage, use a convenient sample. 3. Increasing the sample size tends to reduce survey bias. And 4. To guard against non-response bias, use a mail-in survey. Now, answers are A, 1 only, B, 2 only, C, 3 only, D, 4 only, E, none of the above. The correct answer is E. None of the statements is true. Random sampling provides strong protection against bias from undercoverage bias and voluntary response bias, but it is not effective against response bias. A convenient sample does not protect against undercoverage bias at all. In fact, it sometimes causes undercoverage bias. Increasing the sample size does not affect the survey bias. Remember, it decreases the sampling error. Using a mail-in survey does not prevent non-response bias. In fact, mail-in surveys are quite vulnerable to non-response bias. Many people will not send back in a mail survey. This is the end of the video on surveys and bias. Remember to complete your WSQ in your spiral notebook.